freight car shuddered to a stop.
Metal scraped against metal, the sound sharp enough to cut through the grey September afternoon.
Kent, England, a railway siding west of Ashford, where the landscape still wore its war scars like open wounds. 47 women stepped down onto gravel that glistened with oil and yesterday's rain. Their boots, worn through at the heels, found unsteady purchase on ground that felt foreign despite being solid. They had travelled from the skeletal remains of Germany through American transit camps where hunger had become a language everyone spoke fluently. Now this, British soil.
Enemy territory.
The place their commanders had warned them about in whispers that tasted like ash. The propaganda had been specific. Surrender to the British meant slow death, starvation by policy, brutality as routine. They would be worked until their bones showed through skin, then discarded. Women, especially women who had worn the Wehrmacht auxiliary uniform, would face particular cruelty.
Revenge for London's burning.
Retribution measured in suffering, so they descended from that train expecting violence. What they found was a British sergeant holding a clipboard. He stood flanked by 2 young soldiers whose faces still carried the softness of boys pretending to be men. The sergeant watched the women stumble into something resembling formation, watched how some clutched empty satchels like shields, how others swayed with exhaustion so profound it had become their natural state. One woman's knees buckled. She caught herself halfway down, pride fighting gravity. The sergeant moved before his men could. His hand found her elbow, steadied her weight, and he spoke something quiet in German that bent at the edges from his British tongue. Then he nodded. The young soldiers moved down the ragged line, carrying tin mugs. Steam rose from each one, carrying the smell of something the women had almost forgotten existed. Tea, hot. Real sugar dissolved at the bottom.
Milk that turned the liquid the color of a promise. The women stared at those mugs as though they were hallucinations.
As though reaching for them might shatter whatever cruel trick this was. Some drank immediately, burning their tongues and not caring. Others held the warmth between palms that had grown accustomed to cold and wept without making sound. The sergeant returned to his clipboard. His voice carried no emotion, just procedure.
Processing at the camp.
Medical examination first.
No rough treatment.
You are prisoners of war under British custody.
That designation means something here. He paused.
Looked at the faces in front of him, then added in careful German that came out slowly, like he was translating each word twice before releasing it. You will be fed. A woman with hair the color of weak tea looked up. Her name was Ilse Hartmann, 23 years old. Radio operator? Survivor? Her lips moved, testing words she no longer knew how to trust. The sergeant held her gaze for half a second, then turned and walked toward waiting trucks. Behind him, 47 women climbed aboard, clutching tin mugs like they were proof of something they couldn't yet name. Civilization sometimes whispers. Sometimes it announces itself in gestures so small they could be missed entirely if you blinked. But these women weren't blinking. They had learned in camps where blinking meant missing your only meal. That attention was survival. They carried beliefs across the wreckage of Europe. Beliefs that had been pressed into them in barracks that smelled of fear and fuel. Beliefs printed in newspapers that no longer existed, in a language that was being rewritten as they traveled. They had been told the enemy wore many faces, but all were cruel. The British would strip them of dignity before stripping them of life. The Americans ran chaotic transit camps where rations vanished into administrative black holes. The Soviets operated frozen graves disguised as detention centers. Choose your death, the propaganda had said. There are no good options, so when they stepped off that train expecting the worst, expecting shouting and blows and the casual brutality of victors, and instead received a tin mug of tea, something cracked. Not loudly, not completely. But the foundation of everything they thought they knew developed its first fracture. The camp existed at the edge of farmland that rolled toward the downs. Low wooden huts arranged in neat rows, wire surrounding them that looked more administrative than punishing. Guards patrolled with a rhythm that felt routine rather than aggressive.
No dogs straining at leashes.
No shouting that echoed off buildings designed to amplify intimidation. Just boots on gravel and the low murmur of English spoken too quickly to follow. Processing happened in a converted barn. Names checked against manifests typed in triplicate. A British officer sat behind a desk, temples grey, eyes carrying the exhaustion of someone who had seen too much and chosen to remain decent anyway. He asked questions through an interpreter: name, rank, unit, service dates. Medical conditions, Ilsa answered carefully. She had learned in the American camps that honesty could be a weapon pointed at yourself. But this officer barely looked up. He made notes,
Stamped a form.
waved her toward a door marked medical. Inside, a British Army nurse waited, middle-aged, efficient. She gestured for Ilsa to sit, then examined her with brisk competence, checked her throat.
Her eyes, her pulse, asked about lice, disease, injuries that might need immediate attention. When the nurse pressed fingers against Ilsa's ribs and felt bone too close to skin, her mouth tightened.
She said something sharp in English to an orderly, who disappeared and returned with a biscuit and a small tin of condensed milk. The nurse opened it, poured a measure into a cup,
Added hot water.
handed it to Ilsa. Drink slowly, she said in accented but clear German. Your stomach will rebel if you rush. Ilsa stared at the cup. The sweetness rising from it made her throat ache with something that wasn't quite hunger. She wanted to ask why, wanted to understand what this kindness would eventually cost. But the nurse had already turned to the next woman in line, her movements calm and methodical, as though treating enemy prisoners with basic medical care was the most natural thing in the world. The tin mug of tea had been the first crack. This was the second. Small gestures landing with the weight of landmines in reverse, each one dismantling certainty piece by piece. That night, Ilsa lay in a hut with proper bunks and clean blankets, and thought about the nurse's hands. Steady, professional, unmarked by cruelty. She thought about the tea on the platform, the biscuit, the way the sergeant had steadied the woman who stumbled. She thought about propaganda, and for the first time since the war began, she allowed herself to wonder what else had been a lie. What Ilsa couldn't know, lying there with 46 other women breathing in the darkness, was that her treatment wasn't an accident. It was policy. Britain's approach to prisoners of war had been built on pillars that seemed almost archaic in their restraint. Security first. Prisoners behind wire couldn't fight. Humane treatment reduced escape attempts and unrest. A well-fed prisoner was easier to guard than a desperate one. This was pragmatism dressed as mercy. Intelligence second. Prisoners who felt respected were more likely to cooperate. Interrogations without torture yielded better information. Trust, even fragile trust built on small gestures, opened doors that brutality welded shut. Diplomacy third. Britain held German prisoners. Germany held British prisoners. The Geneva Conventions of 1929 had created a web of mutual obligation. Treat prisoners well, and your own soldiers stood a better chance abroad. Violate the rules, and the enemy had license to do the same. Reciprocity was insurance written in international law. Morality fourth. Britain had fought this war, defending civilization against barbarism. To torture or starve prisoners would be to become the thing they opposed. The Royal Army operated imperfectly but deliberately under the belief that victory without principle was hollow. The numbers told the story. By war's end, Britain held over 400,000 German prisoners on its soil. Red Cross inspectors visited regularly. Conditions were Spartan but met international standards. Mortality rates remained under 1%. Food rations met minimum caloric requirements. Medical care was provided. Work assignments were regulated. Abuse, when it occurred, was investigated and punished. This wasn't kindness in the sentimental sense. It was restraint. Civilization under pressure, choosing order over revenge when revenge would have been infinitely easier. The British understood something fundamental. Cruelty is always a choice, and they chose otherwise. The first meal arrived that evening. The mess hut smelled of boiled potatoes and institutional disinfectant. The women lined up with tin plates, moving slowly, uncertain of what came next. A British cook with sleeves rolled to his elbows spooned portions without comment. Mashed potatoes, tinned peas, a slice of spam glistening with fat, bread thick and pale with a scraping of margarine. Plain food.
Ration food.
But hot. Real. More than most of them had seen in weeks. Ilsa sat at a long wooden table and ate with hands that trembled. Across from her, a dark-haired woman named Gisela wept quietly into her potatoes. shoulders shaking. Others ate in silence, chewing slowly, as though afraid the meal might be snatched away mid-bite. One woman laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that broke off into a sob. Guards stood along the walls, watching but not interfering. One of them, a young private with red hair and freckles, shifted uncomfortably and looked away. Later, Ilsa would learn his name was Collins, who died in the Blitz. But tonight he was just a shape in olive drab, and she was just a woman trying to remember how to swallow without crying. After the meal, a British officer stood and read from a typed sheet. Rules, simple, direct, enforced. No unauthorized movement beyond the huts. No contact with civilians without permission. Work assignments would begin within the week. Letters could be written, would be censored, but would be delivered. Medical concerns were to be reported immediately. Refusal to cooperate would result in loss of privileges, not physical punishment. "You are prisoners," the officer said in clear, slow German.
But you are not animals.
"Behave accordingly and you will be treated accordingly." He folded the paper and left. That night, Ilsa lay in her bunk, listening to 46 women breathing in the dark. Some snored, some whispered, some prayed. She thought about everything that had happened in a single day. The mug of tea, the nurse's hands, the food that had filled her belly for the first time in weeks, and she thought about the officer's words. "You are not animals," such a small thing to say, such a low bar to clear. Yet, after everything they had endured, it felt revolutionary. Within a week, work assignments began. Not punishment, policy. The Geneva Conventions permitted prisoner labor provided it was non-military, compensated, and conducted under humane conditions. Britain, desperate for agricultural labor with so many of its men still overseas, saw opportunity. The prisoners saw a chance to earn small wages and escape the suffocating boredom of the huts. Ilsa was sent to a dairy farm 3 miles from camp, along with a dozen other women. They rode in the back of a truck each morning, flanked by a single guard. An older corporal named Davies, who carried a rifle he never pointed, and a thermos of tea he occasionally shared. The farm belonged to a man named Whitmore, 60-something, weathered as old leather. He ran the place with his wife and a teenage son. He stood in the yard that first morning, arms crossed, and looked the women over with a gaze that was wary but not hostile. "Your milk," he said, through an interpreter. "Morning and evening, 6 days a week. You break something, you fix it. You steal, you're gone. You work honest, you'll eat honest. Simple as that." The women nodded. They had expected worse. The work was brutal. Dawn milking began at 5 in the morning, fingers aching in cold that bit through thin gloves, backs bent over wooden stools. The cows were large and indifferent, occasionally kicking, but the rhythm of it became soothing. Pull, squeeze, release. No radios crackling with bad news, no bombs. Just the hiss of milk into pails and the warm, grassy smell of the barn. By the second week, Whitmore's wife began leaving a pot of tea on the workbench, along with thick slices of bread. She said nothing, just set it down and walked away. The women drank it gratefully, hands wrapped around warm tin mugs that were becoming familiar. By the third week, Ilsa could milk a cow faster than Whitmore's son. He admitted it grudgingly. The work became routine, then competence, then, quietly, a source of pride. One afternoon, as Ilsa hauled a pail toward the cooling shed, Whitmore appeared beside her. He took the pail without asking and carried it the rest of the way. When he set it down, he said in slow, careful English, "Good work." Ilsa, whose English was improving in fragments, nodded. "Thank you." Whitmore grunted and walked away. But the next morning, there was an extra slice of bread waiting, and the morning after that, a pat of real butter. Small gestures.
Earned, not given.
The currency of respect built one pail of milk at a time. Not all the locals were as pragmatic. Some refused to acknowledge the prisoners at all, turning away when the trucks passed. Others glared with bitterness that needed no translation. The war had cost Britain dearly. Families had lost sons, brothers, fathers.
Cities had burned. Rationing still pinched tight.
Resentment was a resource that never ran out, but proximity erodes certainty. Mrs. Whitmore, who had said nothing to the prisoners for the first month, began speaking in clipped functional sentences. "Mind the gate. Don't leave tools in the rain." Later, when one of the women caught a fever, Mrs. Whitmore brought her a bowl of soup herself, set it down on the bunk, and left without a word. The girl returned to work the next day. By winter, small shifts had accumulated into something larger. Ilse was allowed to walk unescorted from the barn to the house when she needed to fetch supplies. The teenage son who had once glared at her now joked in broken German about the cows. And on Christmas Eve, when the women returned to camp after a long day, Whitmore pressed a small parcel into Ilse's hands. Inside, a scarf.
Knitted wool, worn but clean. Wife's, he said gruffly.
Don't need it now. Ilse wanted to say something, but the words tangled. She settled for a nod, clutching the scarf as the truck rattled away. That night she wore it in the hut. Several women asked where it came from. She told them. They said nothing, but their silence wasn't empty. It was the silence of people reconsidering the map of the world they had been handed. Trust, it turned out, wasn't given in declarations. It was built in gestures so small they barely registered until you looked back and realized the ground had shifted beneath you. In late October, a woman named Margot developed a persistent cough that turned bloody. The camp's medical officer, a Scottish doctor named MacLeod, examined her and diagnosed tuberculosis. Within hours, she was transferred to a civilian hospital in Canterbury. The women watched her go with rising fear. Hospitals were where people disappeared. But 3 weeks later, Margot returned. Thinner, yes, but alive. She spoke in a dazed voice about clean sheets, medicine that tasted bitter but worked, and a British nurse who had sat with her during the worst night, reading aloud from a book Margot couldn't understand but found comforting anyway. They treated me, Margot said, still disbelieving. Like I was a person, MacLeod visited the camp weekly, checking chronic ailments and dispensing treatment with the same brisk efficiency he would have used on British soldiers. He didn't smile often, but he didn't sneer either. When Ilse asked him once why he bothered, he looked at her as though the question itself was absurd. "You're ill," he said simply. "I'm a doctor," a statement so plain it felt radical. Medical care for German prisoners in Britain was comprehensive. Serious cases transferred to hospitals, vaccinations administered. Dental care, though basic, provided. Mortality rates from disease remained negligible, a stark contrast to the chaos of some American or French transit camps where logistics had collapsed under the weight of numbers. Britain had decided that letting prisoners suffer was beneath it, not because prisoners deserved mercy in some abstract sense, but because a civilized nation didn't abandon its standards under pressure. MacLeod never said any of this. He simply treated his patients and moved on. But his actions, repeated week after week, carved out a truth the women couldn't ignore. The enemy they had been taught to fear was capable of restraint. And restraint, they were learning, was its own form of power. Christmas came with frost that turned the camp's wire into silver lace. The women hadn't expected to celebrate. Prisoners didn't get holidays. But the British operated differently. On Christmas Eve, the camp commandant, a soft-spoken major named Henshaw, announced that a service would be held in the mess hut. Attendance was optional. A German-speaking chaplain had been arranged. Ilse went, along with most of the others. The hut had been decorated sparsely. A small pine tree, a string of paper garlands, candles set on windowsills. The chaplain, a thin man with kind eyes, read from the Gospel of Luke in careful German. The women sang quietly, voices cracking on the high notes. When the service ended, guards who had stood respectfully at the back brought in trays, biscuits, chocolate, tinned fruit, small luxuries hoarded from rations. They set them on tables without ceremony and stepped back. Major Henshaw cleared his throat. "Happy Christmas," he said in accented German. Then in English to his men, "At ease." The guards relaxed. One of them, Private Collins, approached hesitantly and offered Ilse a cigarette. She shook her head. She didn't smoke, but thanked him anyway. He nodded, embarrassed, and retreated. Later that night, as the women sat in the hut with full stomachs and the faint warmth of human kindness lingering, Gisela said softly, "I didn't think they would remember we were Christian too." No one answered, but several women nodded. In December, the women were told they could write letters home. The letters would be censored, of course. Delivery wasn't guaranteed. Germany was fractured, occupied, its postal system a patchwork of chaos. But the offer was made. Ilse sat with a pencil and thin paper, trying to find words for her mother. She couldn't say where she was.
That would be censored.
She couldn't describe the farm, the food, the kindness. She didn't know if her mother would believe it. In the end, she wrote, "I am alive. I am fed. I am treated fairly. Do not worry. Simple, safe, true." Her letter, along with dozens of others, passed through the hands of a British censor, was stamped, and eventually made its way east. Months later, Ilse would learn that her mother had received it, that it had been read aloud in a neighbor's kitchen, that the neighbor whose son was still missing had wept and said, "At least someone's children are safe." The letters carried weight beyond their words. They were evidence, proof that the propaganda had lied. That surrender to the British didn't mean death. In towns across occupied Germany, those letters became quiet arguments against despair. The British, whatever else they were, had kept their prisoners alive,
Had fed them.
had not tortured them. The contrast with Soviet camps, where letters rarely came and conditions were brutal, sharpened the point. One letter couldn't undo a war, but multiplied by hundreds, by thousands, they became a chorus, whispering a subversive truth. Restraint was possible. Civilization could survive. By early 1946, routines had solidified: work, meals, sleep. But within that structure, small freedoms began emerging. A camp library was established, stocked with donated books in German and English. Ilse borrowed a battered copy of Jane Eyre, reading it slowly, dictionary in hand. A music club formed. Women with instruments or memories of instruments gathered twice a week to sing. Harmonies rose through the hut, filling cold air with something warmer than blankets. Guards tolerated it. Some even stopped to listen. Language classes began. A handful of British soldiers, bored and curious, offered to teach English in exchange for German lessons. The exchanges were awkward, full of laughter and mispronunciations, but they created a bridge where none had existed. One evening, Private Collins sat across from Ilse at a rough wooden table, pointing at words in a primer. Chair, table, window. Ilse repeated them carefully. When she got window wrong, he corrected her gently. When she got it right, he grinned. "You're good at this," he said. She smiled. "You are patient, teacher." It was a small moment, insignificant on its face, but it was also two people who had been enemies, choosing to sit together and share knowledge. That choice, repeated night after night, was its own form of victory. Not everything was smooth. Discipline was necessary.
Rules were broken.
One afternoon, a woman named Hilda tried to smuggle extra food from the farm back to camp. She was caught at the gate, bread bulging beneath her coat. The guard, a stern sergeant named Morris, confiscated it and reported her. Hilda expected punishment, a beating perhaps, solitary confinement. Instead, she was called to Major Henshaw's office. He sat behind his desk, looking tired. "You stole," he said flatly. "I was hungry," Hilda replied, defiant and ashamed. Henshaw leaned back. "You are fed here. 3 meals a day? You know this?" Hilda said nothing. "Not enough, perhaps, but stealing is not permitted."
You understand?
She nodded. "You will lose recreation privileges for 1 week," Henshaw said. "No library.
No music club. That is your punishment.
If it happens again, the consequences will be more severe." Hilda stared.
That's all?
Henshaw's gaze was steady. "The barbed wire is the punishment. I don't need to add more." It was a philosophy the British Guards seemed to share. Confinement was penalty enough. Cruelty on top served no purpose. When a guard lost his temper and shoved a prisoner, he was reprimanded publicly. When another made inappropriate comments, he was reassigned. The message was clear. Discipline was necessary, but brutality was not. The line between the two was carefully maintained. To the women who had known camps where guards ruled by fear and fists, this restraint was almost incomprehensible. But over time it became the norm. The wire was real, the rules were real, but within those boundaries dignity was preserved, and dignity, they were learning, wasn't a luxury. It was the foundation of everything else. By spring 1946, something remarkable had happened. The war had been over for nearly a year, but repatriation was slow. Agreements between the Allies and the fractured German zones were tangled. Logistics lagged. Many prisoners remained in Britain waiting. But waiting had changed shape. Ilse no longer needed an escort to walk from camp to Whitmore's farm. She left each morning with the other women, unsupervised, and returned each evening. The trust was implicit. If they ran, where would they go? Britain was an island.
Germany was rubble, but more than practicality held them.
Something quieter had taken root. Routine, respect. The knowledge that running would betray the small.
Hard-earned trust that had been built at the farm.
Whitmore now let Ilse operate the tractor during ploughing season. Machinery was valuable. Misuse could be costly. But he handed her the controls with a brief nod and walked away. She drove carefully, feeling the weight of his trust as much as the machine. One afternoon during summer harvest, the workload became overwhelming. Whitmore was short-handed and a storm threatened. Without being asked, Ilse and the other women volunteered to stay late, working until dusk, to bring the hay in before the rain. They weren't paid extra. They simply did it. Whitmore said nothing that night. But the next morning, he brought tea to the barn himself and poured it into their mugs. "Good people," he muttered, then walked away before anyone could respond. The shift was subtle but profound. The women were no longer prisoners being supervised. They were laborers being relied upon. They had earned their place not through pleading or performance, but through competence and consistency. Pride returned. Not the hollow, brittle pride of propaganda, but something quieter. Pride of work done well.
Of trust honored. That, more than anything, marked the final erosion of the old beliefs. Ilse sat on the steps of the hut one evening in late June, watching light fade over the downs.
The air smelled of cut grass and distant rain. She thought about the last year, about the mud and the fear.
About the tea on the platform.
About Whitmore's scarf and the chaplain's candles and MacLeod's steady hands. She thought about the propaganda, the lies that had shaped her understanding of the world. If the British weren't monsters, what else had been false? If prisoners could be treated with decency, what did that say about the cause she had once served? The thoughts were dangerous, unsettling, unavoidable. Years later, when historians interviewed former prisoners, Ilse would be among them. Her words would be recorded in a transcript filed away in an archive few would read. "I expected cruelty," she would say. "I had been told the British were brutal."
That they would starve us, beat us, use us.
Yes, it was a prison. Yes, we were not free. But they did not need to treat us as human. They chose to. And that choice forced me to question everything I had believed. If they could be decent, then perhaps we had not been. That was the hardest truth of all. She would pause in the recording, her voice quiet. The real prison was not the wire. It was the lie I had lived inside. The tape would end shortly after. But the truth in those words would linger. Repatriation finally came in autumn 1946. The women were processed once more, given documents, told they could return to Germany. Trains were arranged.
Camps emptied.
Some left immediately, desperate to find family, to rebuild, to go home. Others hesitated. Ilse stood in line with her papers and thought about home. Her mother's letters had been brief. The village was half destroyed. Food was scarce. Work was scarcer. The occupation zones were tangled with bureaucracy and bitterness. Germany wasn't a home anymore. It was a wound. She thought about Whitmore's farm.
About the rhythm of the work.
About the quiet trust that had been built. When she reached the processing desk, the British officer looked up. Repatriation or voluntary extension? Extension, she said quietly. He stamped her papers without comment. Not all the women stayed, but some did. They worked through the winter of 1946, earning small wages, sending money home when they could. By 1947, as conditions in Germany stabilized, most returned. But a few, very few, chose to settle permanently. They married British men or found work in towns that no longer saw them as enemies. Ilse stayed for another year, then left in spring 1947. Whitmore drove her to the station himself. They didn't say much. There wasn't much to say. "Safe journey," he said, handing her a parcel. Inside, a loaf of bread, fresh and warm. She nodded, unable to speak, then boarded the train. Years later, she would write him a letter.
He would write back.
The correspondence would continue sporadically for decades. Small updates, news of family, a photograph of Ilse's children, a postcard from Whitmore's visit to London. The war had ended, but the quiet bond it had forged, unlikely and resilient, endured. Civilization isn't the absence of conflict. It's the choice made daily to maintain standards when abandoning them would be easier. The British didn't have to treat their prisoners with decency. They could have justified cruelty 100 ways: revenge, efficiency, indifference. The temptation was real, and in some places it won, but in most camps, on most farms, in most encounters, restraint prevailed. Not because it was easy.
Because it was chosen, the tea on the platform.
The nurse's steady hands, the chaplain's candles, the farmer's trust. Each was a small refusal to let the war strip away what mattered. The women who lived through it carried that knowledge forward. It changed them in ways they couldn't articulate but couldn't deny. They had expected monsters and found men. They had expected brutality and found order. And that contradiction forced them to reconsider everything. The real victory in the end wasn't territorial. It was moral. Britain proved that a nation at war could remain a nation of laws. That power, enormous and unchecked, could still choose restraint. The tin mugs handed out on that railway platform became symbols. Not grand or dramatic, but humble. A reminder that decency, when practiced consistently, accumulates into something larger, something that outlasts the war itself.